thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. If you don't mind, let's just jump in. It might be worthwhile just giving a quick background on yourself, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me. My name is Ala. I obtained, actually, probably better first start off very early. I'm a co-founder of the Open Tensor Foundation, along with Jacob Steves. To start off, actually, my career specifically in AI. Obtained my PhD in 2017 from McMaster University in applied artificial intelligence, which was actually a lot of fun because we got to I really got to learn the hard way on how to build a product from the very beginning. So basically, we were building sensors that would detect human movement or human electricity, bioelectricity, or body heat, and basically infer certain human actions from that, whether somebody's typing or if there's some lactic acid come out of the muscles as a result of that and stuff like that. So kind of, really went from sketch design all the way up to PCBs, all the way out to actually building the firmware and the classical AI models that went on top of that. And so really kind of got to learn how to build a real product from start to finish, really. Afterwards, I kind of decided to try my hand at something a little different. So I went to distributed computing route. I joined VMware in 2017 right after graduation. Worked in Palo Alto for about 2 years. Then decided to join Instacart for a little bit, kind of do a little bit more on the software development side of things. And I met Jacob, interestingly enough, through the founder of Cohere, Aiden Gomez. He kind of introduced us together when we worked at a not-for-profit called 4AI. And at the time, I had just presented honestly, just off the wall ideas I had about distributed compute. And then Jacob kind of reached out to me and he was like, hey, nice idea, but I'm like 5 years ahead of you. So just come join me. Let's work on this together. And so that's when OpenTensor was born, really. We kind of, interestingly, we built through COVID. So we kind of just, he was in Peru, I was in Toronto. We kind of just started building and building and building, went through several iterations until 2021 in January. We launched the first Kusanagi network at the time it was called. And we ran that up until the end of 2021, actually mid-2021. And then we paused it and we ran it again in November. And it's been on since then.
Awesome. That's great context. So let's just kind of set the stage here. What is Bittensor? Yeah, if you could
Yeah,
just give us your your pitch. I think it's a lot of different things to a lot of different people at this point.
it is. Yeah, it is. I think it's best to kind of describe it, I want to say, from a very simplistic perspective, and then maybe we can dive into details later for kind of set more color to it. So at its core, really, Bittensor is a protocol for peer-to-peer machine learning and inference. That's really it in one sentence. We are leveraging the power markets to democratize access to AI and incentivize people to actually contribute their AI models. And we sort of take advantage of the open source movement and the ability of open source AI models to actually make AI available to the public. So in essence, we're incentivizing people to create cutting edge open source models and to also compete with those models at the same time. So we're sort of setting up a benchmark where really AI is judging AI at the end of the day, right? There is no sort of human intervention in checking which model is better and which model is worse. So to kind of make it more specific, there's two main actors in the system. You have your miners and you have your validators. Now, the miners will contribute to the system by running AI models that will solve a specific task, let's say image generation. And the validators will basically contribute to the system by ensuring that all the miners are running legitimate AI models and they're not really cheating the system, so to speak. Now, the network itself is divided into subnetworks. That's actually our most recent update, and that's sort of when things sort of started skyrocketing, which are basically neighborhoods within the network. That's the best way to think of them. These neighborhoods do specific tasks. Let's say you have one neighborhood or one subnetwork for text generation, one subnetwork or a neighborhood for image generation, for classification, and so on. And so the miners and the validators will participate in one or many of these neighborhoods. And they're basically incentivized to compete with their peers for tau, which is the token that's being issued by the system. And
Gotcha.
yeah, just kind of last thing is that it's pretty exciting because now we effectively have what is really a mega mall of machine learning tools and models. And there's subnets now for storage, subnets for compute, subnets for images, for zero knowledge proofs, etc. So now what we have is basically almost becoming, or what we want to become, a one-stop shop, really, for any AI tool usage or inference or training.
Great. Yeah, appreciate that. And we'll dive into, I think, a lot of those specifics in a few minutes. As far as AI inference, is
Hmm.
concerned specifically, what would you describe as like the value proposition of Bittensor? It's, you know, okay, great. We have this decentralized marketplace for AI running on crypto rails. It's a lot of buzzwords, right? And I
Yeah.
think, you know, people from maybe like the AI community might look at a project built on crypto rails and be dismissive. How would you describe the value proposition of what Bittensor is doing? Like whether it's from a performance, cost, censorship resistance standpoint? Yeah, could you dig
Yeah.
into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of read this line in a paper when we first started working at Bittensor, and it kind of stuck with me since and sort of become like um, my personal thesis and sort of the project's overall ethos as well. Is that we value um, resilient generalists over narrow specialists, right? And that's something that's really um, it's becoming more and more what people really are looking for. If you look at ChatGPT, for example, it's a really good generalist, right? But when you ask into a specialization, asking very specific questions, it's ripe with misinformation. It's ripe with garbage. It'll send you some weird stuff and stuff that's just outright false, right? Now, if you look at Bittensor as a comparison, right, with ChatGPT, you swipe your credit card, you get access to the API, you ping the API, you get back a response, done. With Bittensor, what you're really doing is instead of speaking to one ChatGPT, for example, you're speaking to hundreds, if not thousands, of different models, and each one could be um, specialized in something different, right? So let's say, for example, you asked a question about cellular biology, right? ChatGPT might give you an answer that it may be pulled from some paper that I went through, right? But on BitTensor, you're likely to get a more nuanced answer because there could be a model on there that is actually trained on biological papers, right? It can give you much more detail that is more correct and more accurate than something that's just generally trained by one company. So what we're really doing is sort of generalizing, you're sort of getting a lot of generalizability as a result, and you're sort of not relying on one single entity, right? If tomorrow OpenAI came and told you, hey, um, we detected some weird stuff with your credit card or with your account, we're going to shut you down. And that's it. It's over. Your entire business model just crashed because you were based on OpenAI, right? Whereas with Bittensor, it doesn't really matter if one miner goes down. There's so many others to replace it. And there's other people coming in to compete and try to replace that miner in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I always describe to people is like BitTensor is sort of a hydra, right? Like you can cut off one miner, but you can't cut off all of them, right? And if one miner or model, you know, degrades relative to its peers, then another one will rise to the top. And I think the other thing that you touched on there was really from a performance standpoint, BitTensor has the ability to specialize in basically every domain because you're bringing a lot of different entities from all over the place and all over specialties to the network. And when you talk about that, is that like mixture of experts or is that a little bit separate?
It's a tad separate. So Mixture of Experts is actually a little bit older. It's an older iteration of BitTensor at this point. I don't quote me on this. I'm not fully 100% sure. I think our programmers and probably Jacob are much more in tune with this. But I don't believe we're using quite exactly a Mixture of Experts anymore.
Hmm.
Having said that, people with the subnetwork can certainly introduce that back in if they want to. And that's something we could delve into a little bit later. But it's more because um, the the setup that we have now with each subnetwork, it means that every single subnet owner can actually define their own incentive mechanism. And what that means is that because you can define your incentive mechanism, you can define even your own objective function. And so that means that any miner that joins the system, all they really need to do is just tune to that objective function, try to make it better, try to basically beat their peers by doing something better there. In that sense, if somebody does badly, for example, if it's just an innocently bad model, doesn't really need to be a something as catastrophic as a terrible actor or something like that. The system kind of just calls it out, right? Somebody new registers, they get the worst performing one gets faced out, and then one next one comes in. So kind of ensure that there's always quality over quantity most of the time.
Got it. Got it. The one other thing that I honed in on a little bit, I think I was listening to Mog Machine at it was a at Urban Assembly. He was
Mm-hmm.
talking about kind of the unified experience of using BitTensor in that you can have uh, all these different resources under potentially one API. I'm wondering if you can dive in a little bit into how that might actually be possible. If I, um, because as I understand it, I might be using an API from a specific validator, and that validator might be plugging into one or maybe all subnets.
Hmm.
Um, and from a developer standpoint, I could see that being potentially interesting because you don't have to go grab resources from all over the place. You can just tap into one one API. Is it am I completely off there, or
No, you're
could
good. You're
you?
actually on the right track. Yeah, yeah. So that's actually you're tapping on two different subjects here, right? So first of all, the validators. Yes, the validators can actually plug into any subnet they want as long as they can run that model's that subnet's code, right? So let's say I have one big machine. I've got, let's say, 30 GPUs. I can dedicate those GPUs to each different subnet if I want to, right? And then this way I could just validate on different subnets, right? Using my same wallet. Now, the other aspect that you're talking about, which is the AP, the unified API, what we're really talking about here is standardization, right? And that is actually the next big step on Bittensor is we need to start standardizing now, right? Now that we have the supply, we have some demand, which is great, and we're sort of growing. Now it's time to standardize. And that means that really, like, one of the big things that need to be done is to release an API that every validator can use and every validator can adapt to it. So that means that this API can be really self-adapting to whatever you're validating it, right? So let's say, for example, I'm validating on text, image, and audio, right? All I need to do is just grab this API. It's part of my validation mechanism, and it's the same API that everyone else is using. It's just that it adapts to my own validation. If I'm validating in image, text, and audio, then it's the API that lets me access image, text, and audio, right? Um, Having said that, it's actually more of a software development problem than it is a research and development or even an AI problem, because really you're just building API to actually plug into different services. That's all it is. So it's more like, I think the longer arching question is how do we standardize this across all validators? And that's one of the things we're looking at next year.
Maybe on
And
that note, oh, sorry, go ahead.
mhm. No, I was just gonna add one more thing. One of the other things as well that this, API, whatever you want to call it, will need to do too, is to abstract away the complexities of crypto and AI from the actual API usage itself, right? If you look at ChatGPT, for example, if I'm just a regular user who doesn't have an AI background, it's a magic box. I just want a credit card and it gives me answers. That's all it is. And that's actually one of the beautiful things that OpenAI actually did with this, is that it's so easy to use. And that's what we need to strive towards next, is to abstract away the crypto side, abstract away the AI side, and really it's the magical box that works for everybody. And that's how we sort of will start penetrating the more I want to say layman user base.
Yeah, we like to think a lot about go-to-market, in sort of the crypto space, which has been tricky for everybody. And particularly I think around that idea that you've just been discussing. When you think about, I think we're somewhat familiar with how, initially when you're bootstrapping a network, there's an inflation that needs to happen to be able to incentivize, the different participants to come into the table, right? And
Mm-hmm.
BitTensor is doing this amazing job of, on the one side, like sort of creating this gravitational pull, attracting on the one hand the miners, or let's say the models that can do all sorts of things. On the other side, the potential demand of people that need businesses, consumers, whatever, that need a problem resolved. If you think sort of into the future as to what, let's say, a sustainable BitTensor network looks like, is that mostly focused around this sort of unified experience that Phil, was sort of asking about with the single API? Is that sort of the vision that you think BitTensor is moving towards, or is it much more of a, marketplace, fragmented, a lot of different things for a lot of different people type?
I think the answer is somewhere in the middle, to be honest. It just because we use, for example, say something like a unified API doesn't mean that it can't be a marketplace that's a lot of different things for a lot of different people, right? We could look at the API example as just really a way to bring in these external developers to build on top of the subnetwork, right? Those people are sort of ultimately what will drive a lot of the applications on top of the system. And really, if you really think about it, they're also the people who will bring the system to the mainstream in the first place. So enabling them to do that is definitely going to be like it's going to be a challenge, of course, but that is actually one of the reasons why we're looking at abstracting away all of the AI and all of the crypto sides of things, right? And that's something that I always talk about is I've been to a few quite a few crypto conferences since I started doing this. And as an AI person, to be honest with you, if I'd come in without any crypto knowledge, a lot of them make no sense to me, right? Because they're very geared towards a crypto audience. And some of the technologies are amazing, but nobody's going to get it because they're not really gearing towards an audience who doesn't understand crypto in the first place. And so one of the things that we need to do is we need to bridge this gap, right? Bridging it with developers, maybe that's actually one of the big pushes that we're trying to do, is how do we enable any developer to join the system and build on top of it as well? And that includes documentation, that includes API wrappings, that includes a whole slew of things that we want to release next year. And the other side of it is how do we ensure that the people who are already in the system and really the democratized market aspect of it is not compromised as a result, right? We want to enable the let's say, for lack of a better example, the disgruntled OpenAI employee to come into the system and build their own subnetwork and actually build something really cool on top of the system that is an actual utility, right? And they're incentivized to do that still without sacrificing the integrity of that. So that's sort of the line we're trying to walk for the next year. It's going to be a very fine line, but I think we're fairly capable of doing that.
Maybe just to wrap this question up, but are there any key partnerships, that you think the Bittensor network will have to, strike in order to push that specific problem forward?
Yeah, I think that specifically, and I say this all the time, I think if you've heard the other podcasts I participated in, I think specifically what we really need to do is we need to bring in the AI talent, right? There's a lot of people in the system now that are doing a great job, but they might not be, AI researchers or AI engineers. They're more software developers that taught themselves AI to work on top of the system, or crypto developers who taught themselves AI. And that is absolutely awesome and absolutely commendable that people are actually teaching themselves this complicated topic to participate in it. But I feel like somebody with a lot of theoretical knowledge of AI will actually have a lot to contribute as well. And those are the people who want to yank in for the next year. And interestingly enough, they're very crypto averse, which fair enough. People in the, all of us in the crypto space have had a few eggs thrown in our face this year. But I think that if we speak their language and if we actually come at them from the angle of, this is not snake oil, this is actually developed by an AI company that is happening to use a blockchain to solve a problem, then that's really going to be the I want to say the key to strike here, right? And that is usually done by either publications in respective conferences. So we've been publishing in, for lack of a better term, we've been either lead authors or co-authors of a paper on neural IPS for the last 2 years. And it's been very good, a lot of really good exposure. We want to participate even more than that. Like next year, we want to participate in more conferences. We want to actually be a known platform in the AI community. That's sort of where the key is going to be at. And sort of incentivizing them that way is going to be, that's really going to be the hard part, because they already have a bad misconception. Bring it in and be like, we're the good guys here. So yeah, I think that's one of the key partnerships that we want to do for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be huge. It seems like Bittensor is sort of at an inflection point where things are working, well enough and starting to see real innovation, especially with like the absolute boom in subnets only being live for 2 or 3 months. Let's dive in a little bit into how Bittensor really works, right? Like you briefly described the 2-layer system, which is basically validators and miners. Miners being the suppliers of a digital resource, whether that is compute, text-based, inference, image-based, multimodality. Really, the universe is kind of endless. And then validators are basically just these entities that make sure that the output coming from these miners is good and valid, and they rank them so that you can put these incentive schemes together. Can you maybe dive in and fill in any gaps that I might be missing there?
Yeah, there's quite a lot to the story. Interestingly enough, you can look at it as sorry, I'm trying to think of a good analogy to this specifically. I'll tell you what, think of it like a graph, right? There's 2 types of nodes in this graph, right? You have your validators and your miners. And effectively, what's going to happen is each validator is going to ping a subset of these miners at a given point in time. So let's say, for lack of a better term, let's say we're working on our text subnetwork, right? This is kind of the easiest example because it's the oldest one at this point, really. And so what each validator does is going to query a subset of miners periodically. And when a miner is queried, it's gonna be expected to be performing useful work. And that means that I can query it and say, okay, give me back a prompt. Give me the, for example, give me the synopsis of Lord of the Rings, let's say, in a French accent, right? And what it's going to do is the miner is going to respond back with that query. And the type of work is going to depend on that subnet. So for example, if it's an image, it's going to say a different prompt. Let's say, generate an image of, say, a speaker system in a concert, or, et cetera, for each different subnetworks. And the miners really have to respond before a time limit with the proof of the work that they actually did. If they don't respond in that time limit, then they get penalized. If they do, then their response is actually analyzed through, at least it's in our design, through a layer of reward models. So these reward models really do is they basically just check, your diversity, your validity, your relevancy of the response of your miner directly to the validator and what the validator is actually expecting in the first place. And so according to that, then you get basically ranked according to whoever's with you, like basically, ranked according to the peers who are with you. And that ranking is recorded on the blockchain eventually. So in doing so, really, we're taking out the AI from the blockchain completely. It's actually everyone's running their own AI. And the blockchain really just contains a ranking. So there's a lot more complexity to it, but for lack of a better term, it really only contains the ranking. And that ranking basically determines who gets rewarded how much as a result, whether it's validators or the miners. Now, as you repeat this process, eventually every single miner is going to get pinged, and every single miner will be ranked, and every single miner will basically get either reward or be penalized for it as a result. And so to caveat this further, this is only for our subnetwork, and that's actually going to change very soon because there is obviously a lot of issues with this sort of design. Like, for example, what's stopping somebody from fine-tuning to the reward model so they always get the right response? It's because you have open source, you have a lot of different problems you have to tackle. And that's, again, sort of undergoing an overhaul. And the beauty of it is that because Bittensor is actually able to ingest any technology, that means that the subnet owners have full control over how they do this process. You don't have to use reward models. You could use whatever you want to use. Whatever works for you, use that. And if you're able to do it properly, then you've sort of really incentivized your miners with the reward, right? And that's really what it's all about. That's what really building a subnet is all about. You want to incentivize your miners and validators with the reward that's coming out, right? And that incentive is actually a balance, right? You want to disincentivize them from cheating, and you want to incentivize them to actually do things properly.
Yeah, on that point, the two of the really important things in this is accurate benchmarking and properly aligned incentives, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds to me that those are both customizable within each subnet, right? Or actually even within each validator's software, right? How exactly you benchmark. Can you dig into exactly how benchmarking works? You first started with AI inference, which I think is actually the most ambitious benchmarking to do because it's so subjective. But yeah, can you just dive into like first how the benchmarking for kind of inference works, and then maybe how benchmarking has expanded from there into these other subnetworks?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's actually rather technical. I think I could probably just dive into the I want to say the pencil tips of the whole thing, and then we can probably deep dive into it, but it's like a full-on article later. So actually, we initially started with was training. At the very, very early iterations of Bittensor, we were focused on training. We weren't focused on inference at all, right? And the problems with that is how do you verify something was trained properly, right? And at the time, we were using a lot of different methodologies to actually measure whether a miner did better or worse as a result of the contributions of its peers. So for example, one of the things that we used to do is we used to measure basically what is the impact of removing a miner from the network on its peers? Are they going to do worse? Are they going to do better? And then as a result, reward them that way. It became rather complicated, and we found that there's actually a simpler approach to this. And that's sort of when we came up with sort of what is called what we're calling the Fini fork, which happened earlier this year. And we sort of decided to focus on inference a little bit more first, and then also bring in pre-training as well. So pre-training is actually already being done on 7.9. That's being done by Jacob. And I think they've already reached GPT-2 performance, which is pretty crazy considering they started like a month ago. And they're moving more towards GPT-3 and 4 probably eventually. Now, in the way that we benchmark inference, right? So for example, that really, because as yet is subjective, it's really up to the validator. right? So you need to basically pick out, for example, in the example of the subnet one architecture that I described, you have to pick out reward models that are as unsubjective as possible. Now, of course, that is not quite easy to do because every reward model that's out there, it's actually not that good because there's not that much data to train on. At the same time, that reward model that you create will always be biased towards whoever created that reward model in the first place, right? Now, because of that, benchmarking and actually measuring the output of specifically for text, for example, is an ever evolving challenge. We're always working on this sort of thing. Now, the silver lining in this, which is actually a gigantic one, and we're pretty happy about it, is that because a lot of people are trying to cheat the system, we're getting a lot of data as a result, right? A lot of bad data, which is great because we love bad data. So we can actually train our own role model against this sort of thing if we wanted to, right? So as a result, one of the things that you can do to actually benchmark properly is to train on the data you're getting, right? It's okay if you get a bad subnetwork for a little while, right? Use that data, train something that can actually tell bad from good according to what you're trying to validate. So let's say, for example, if you have an image subnetwork, train your, say, for example, reward model against that sort of thing, and then you'll be able to actually create a better model against that's basically better guarded against this sort of attack or this sort of issue, and then you get a better merge mark as a result. Again, this is sort of just speaking from subnet one perspective. A lot of different subnetworks actually employ very, very different ways to validate and benchmark, so I can't speak for them specifically, but that is one of the ways you can actually tackle it as a result.
Yeah, that's really interesting that there can be so many different approaches to validation and to benchmarking. Bittensor really is wildly generalizable. It's not just AI inference anymore. There are all these different specialties. I'm wondering if you can dive into how these subnetworks work and how emissions from Bittensor get allocated to any specific subnetwork, right? Because we can start to see this topology, and like I think it's interesting to analyze how value is actually flowing through the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially since each subnet has so much sovereignty in some ways around like how to benchmark and the rest of the things, right? I'm sure it must be a sort of titanic problem for you guys to be
It is huge, yeah.
to keep in check.
It is pretty massive, and that's sort of where the responsibility will eventually lie on the subnet owners. And if the subnet doesn't do well, then that subnet actually will risk getting deregistered as a result. Now, but yeah, the crazy part about Bittensor generally is that it's changing often so much that I'm fairly certain by the time this podcast is published, whatever I said will be completely out of date, really, because people are always adding new stuff. So to kind of delve into the incentivization, how subnetworks actually work initially, right? So right now there's 32 slots in the subnetworks, right? There is a slot 0, that is subnet 0. Now, subnet 0 is actually static, and you can't really deregister it, but it's actually what we call the root subnetwork. And it really contains validators, and the job of those validators is to set weights to the other subnetworks on the system. This weight setting will determine how much emission they get per basically per tau. So, for example, if their emission is, for example, 10%, then they will get 720 tau per day, right? And basically, the subnet owner will receive 18% of that 10%, and then the validators and the miners will each receive 42% of that 10%. So really, the way that we sort of keep this up is up to the validators eventually in the root subnetwork itself.
Gotcha.
And sorry, just to add a little bit more, if let's say a subnetwork has existed for a long time and hasn't really done anything, all the root validators have to do is say, okay, you haven't done much. I don't like what you're doing. I'm just going to take away weight from you. And eventually, when that weight's taken off, and the new subnetwork's trying to register in, then the lowest emission subnetwork will get deregistered as a result. So it's how we kind of ensure a very similar process to how we kick miners out and validators out according to performance, similar to the subnetwork. If there is bad emissions or bad performance as a result, or people don't agree with how that subnetwork's operating, then eventually we'll just get deregistered. So we really ultimately let the markets decide all the time.
Gotcha. I was just going to ask that. I think we're having we're just discussing with Phil about like what is the most valuable subnet for Bittensor right now? What does the sort of a optimized breakdown of subnets look like? Can you maybe give us a sense of what the market or what what users are valuing right now for subnets?
Yeah, I can tell you right now. Give me 1 second. I'm getting that list as we speak. Just one moment. Takes a little
Yeah, I
bit of
guess
time.
to build on that, it's almost like what are the validators look on the root subnet looking at to
Mhm.
determine which subnet is the most valuable and deserves the most emissions?
To be honest with you, at this point, I think it's more of a social problem than anything. It's
Yeah.
really what subnetwork's getting the most attention from everybody, and that's the one that gets a lot of emission. So to give you an example, right now subnet one that's our subnetwork is getting 14% emissions. Subnet 18 is actually getting the most emissions, which is more than the foundation, which is honestly really awesome to hear that somebody's competing that hard. I believe subnet 18 is the Cortex folks. I think they're doing something akin to translation. And then the time series is the other one as well. They're subnet 8. They're doing time series predictions. So it's really interesting because it shows really what the community really cares about at this point, and that's what they think is interesting. If I think, let's say, for example, I care more about image generation, then I'm just going to set all my ways to image generation because that's really much cooler, and et cetera, et cetera. And interestingly enough, a lot of the sort of as we age and as people understand how these subnets are working, a lot of subnet owners are actually starting to experience people trying to cheat the system, right? So initially people were working honestly because they're trying to understand how things work, but now that they're sort of they get it, they try to shortcut their way through, right? How do I get how to get the same reward for less work, basically? And that's where it really is going to be really interesting.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so within each subnetwork, and I guess it's not necessarily at the subnetwork level, but when validators are pinging miners, is there any sort of are miners looking at a minimum amount of tau that validators have delegated to them? Like, similarly, when validators are choosing which miners to ping, is there any kind of decision that they have to make there, or is it all just kind of random?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So validators, theoretically speaking, validators don't really need a specific amount of tau to get a response from miners. You can actually start off with 2 tau if you needed to. But miners have the option to blacklist validators if they so wish, which is actually one of the things that we ran into this year is some of the smaller validators were getting blacklisted and sort of eventually deregistered from the network because they're not getting any responses. And what we found out was interesting is that a lot of the miners will try to optimize their compute by only responding to the big validators. And big here meaning that they're swinging a lot of stake. And so what that really means is that this miner is going to lose out on some of their reward. But because they're only responding to giant validators that have a lot of stake, they're still getting like 80% of their reward that they're looking for in the first place. And so they're saving compute, but sacrificing a little bit of reward. That is part of how the system works. That is sort of how the setup is. And the one thing that I want to add is that because validators can actually operate across subnetworks as a result, smaller validators can actually join the smaller subnetworks that just started to kind of sort of accumulate tau, kind of help that subnetwork grow, and then sort of work their way up to the bigger ones if they needed to.
Gotcha. I mean, it sounds like that was an emergent property almost,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah, exactly.
it's kind of a good one, it seems, uh, in that the validator set is pretty competitive. Um, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting because it is, as you said, it's an emergent property. It was not something we expected to see right off the bat. It was something that we said, might happen later down, but it actually did, it just blew out right at the top. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, that's very cool.
I remember reading at the time that the foundation was considering certain fixes for this, one of them being maybe lending some of the smaller validators a stake, so they could be a little more muscular and be considered a little more by the miners. Has a sort of decision eventually been made that like this is just going to be the way it's run? Do you see like an aggregator type staking service which can maybe bring together all the small validators to allow them to compete in the future, perhaps? Or is this just sort of the way that it's going to keep going for now, you think?
To be honest with you, we are open source. I definitely see people they will eventually try to do this. And if they do, all power to them, really. Eventually, I'm certain that eventually down the line, we'll say something more akin to pools. And people are
Yeah.
basically just going to put together small amounts of tau and then try to do that. And sort of, it's funny because in a way, you can actually already do this with delegation, right? Delegation is effectively a validator pool in a sense, because you're giving out your tau, you're minusing a fee, and that's what you're doing. But sort of a more ad hoc pool in a sense of people small that want to run a validator, that don't want to delegate or anything like that. I can totally see people trying something like this, especially because they're open source. It's very easy to see. Sorry, I just wanted to add one correction. I had accidentally said that Cortex, which is subnet 18, is translation. It's actually not. It's MOG subnet. I confused it with I think it was the other subnet that was actually translation. MOG subnet is the core cell app. I'm sure if you guys not sure if you guys got a chance
Yeah.
to play with that, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. Thanks for that. Cool. So what are kind of the future plans for Bittensor? I've seen some talk of building out, I guess, like the smart contract like execution layers. Is that true? And can you talk to that a little bit?
There's a lot of people working on that sort of thing. Actually, I believe some folks from Foundry had also mentioned they wanted to build something like this. To be honest, we are discussing that sort of layer right now, but we don't have it on the actual, I want to say, pipeline quite yet. Probably going to happen sometime in Q2, Q3 next year, namely because that's inevitability. It's going to happen eventually, but we haven't quite built that yet. In terms of future plans, there's two big ones we're trying to do next year. And if we kind of get that done by end of 2024, I think that we've officially set up Bittensor to be a big player in the system. First would be complete decentralization. And that means that we need to set up our governance, we need to set up ways for people to participate in the system, and we need to enable all subnet owners to actually be able to make big decisions on the network, things like chain upgrades and stuff like that. Right now, that's being done by the foundation, which it really helped us out a lot in the initial stages up until this point, and actually even including this point, because we need to always make a lot of changes to the blockchain very quickly, right? Especially I'm sure you've both seen since you first started looking into Bittensor, so many changes have happened because people find different ways around it, or we found better ways to do the incentive mechanism, or et cetera, et cetera. If we needed to fork every time, or if we needed to sort of do it in sort of a different layer, it would have been a complete mess. So being able to do this very quickly is actually very important, but we're sort of starting to get to the stage where things are stable, and we want to sort of give that control to the community as opposed to us. So what we want by end of 2024 is sort of the Bittensor Foundation to really just be another player in the system. We don't own anything anymore. If somebody comes and shuts our doors down next year, it makes no difference. System still keeps running. Nothing goes down. The second bit is really what we are trying to push for is the AI side, which we already kind of discussed earlier, is we want to bring in these talented Web 2 AI developers into the system and have them contribute and help us build more interesting subnets or solve harder problems or sort of tackle this from a different perspective to kind of grow it in a sense that makes it more mainstream with the AI folks as well, as opposed to just the crypto side or just even the layman side.
Got it. That's awesome. Yeah, I think that the degree of centralization that you guys have right now is like very useful, for iterating and building upon the project. But it's good to hear that you guys have aspirations to really kind of push control outside of the foundation, which I think is going to be very, very necessary if long term we all want Bittensor to be this almost public good in a way.
Yeah, exactly. We're sort of looking at it as the internet back in 1995, right? There's a lot of regulation happening from corporations to try to regulate the internet back in 95. I think famously Microsoft tried to own a monopoly of Internet Explorer. Similarly, it's happening with OpenAI. We are trying to sort of get away from that, sort of build it in a sense that, as you said, it's effectively a public good.
Yep. One of the ways that I describe Bittensor is that it's just a battlefield, right, for all these different miners to come to the network. And the way the output is developed is less important than the output itself, right? That's the whole idea of like the objective function. The objective function is put in place and give me your best results. And at some points, there will be closed source models that are, at the top of the pecking order. But then there will be times when those closed source models, fall down in the rankings relative to some other models. So there's always this battle going on, and just because ChatGPT might be one of the miners in a subnetwork, or maybe the leading miner, it comes back to this Hydra, idea where at any point in time, ChatGPT could be cut off and a new miner might rise to the occasion.
Exactly right. You can also look at it as a proving ground in a lot of ways, right? If you can create a model locally that's actually able to beat all these ChatGPT endpoints, then really you've created something that is able to compete with that endpoint in the first place, right? And if you can compete, then you've, again, as we were discussing before, you're kind of benchmarked using AI as a model that's actually able to beat something as big as ChatGPT in the first place. So it's very interesting to see how that's going to play out, especially as more and more people join the network with their own models instead of just ChatGPT miners in the first place.
Yep, makes sense. Well, this has been great. A lot, thanks so much for taking the time. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think people should know, or anything interesting that you might want to bring up?
I think you covered everything.
Awesome. And where can people reach out to you, or what's the best way to communicate with you?
Either directly on Discord, everyone knows me as ShipShip there. You can reach out to me on my Bittensor email, ala@bittensor.com. Otherwise, yeah, it's probably we'll respond to you quite quick there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time. This was great. Really appreciate it. And we're very excited for the future of Bittensor.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.
This content is provided for informational and educational purposes only and should not be relied upon as financial, legal, or tax advice. Prior to making any investment decision, you should consult with professional financial, legal, and tax advisors to determine the appropriateness of the risks associated with such an investment. No assurance can be given that the objectives of a particular investment will be achieved, or that an investor will receive a return of all or part of his or her investment. All investments involve the risk of loss, including the loss of principal. In no event shall Plaintext Capital Management LLC, Plaintext, or any of its affiliates be responsible or liable for the correctness of any material discussed herein, or for any damage or lost opportunities resulting from the reliance upon such material. References in this podcast to any specific securities or digital assets are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute an investment recommendation or offer to provide investment advisory services. Furthermore, this content is not directed at nor intended for use by any investors or prospective investors. Plaintext and/or its clients may maintain positions discussed on this podcast. Certain information discussed or presented in this podcast may have been obtained from third-party sources. While taken from sources believed to be reliable, Plaintext has not independently verified such information and makes no representations about the enduring accuracy of the information or its appropriateness for a given situation. Any projections, estimates, forecasts, targets, prospects, and/or opinions expressed during this podcast are subject to change without notice and may differ or be contrary to opinions expressed by others.